Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Here we are, another day, another podcast. I'm here with Maria Brandel. Maria, great to see you as always.
Thanks.
Yep. We are just trying to figure out gender in our own special little way, and we hope you are along for the ride.
It's so patronizing.
Yes, thank you if you've been following so far for exploring the mystery of it with us. Just as a quick recap of what we're doing, we're especially looking at the kinds of things necessary for a culture to accept and understand transgenderism as being something pretty blasé and normal, which is about where we're at. It seems to us that many things would need to be put in place, and in fact have been put in place since about the Reformation, but really since the fall of man.
Take it way back.
We have, up to this point, discussed quite a few things: the influence of capitalism, the specific influence of consumerism, as well as the influence of what we call efficacious vanity, the way that vanity has become a marketable and necessary commodity for the sake of human survival in this, our lovely beige world.
Right.
We've also talked about
the loss of the symbolism, loss of the virgin, and how that changes your imagination of the meaning of men and women, especially within Christianity.
It's a strange world in which, precisely by only emphasizing something true to the loss of emphasizing the whole, namely the reality of procreation as part of the meaning of sexual difference, you actually end up losing even what you emphasize, which is kind of where we want to talk about what we want to talk about today. Sort of. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really helpful point when thinking about, morality or theology in general. Like, what happens when you just emphasize a part of the truth to the detriment of the whole? Because it's interesting that in getting something right, you can get the whole thing wrong or just skewed.
Totally.
And I think that's something that we see just kind of in our normal everyday experience too. I don't know if you're trying to interpret a certain situation or trying to like figure out how to interact with a certain person, but if you are just focused on one thing that you see about this situation or about this person, like, you can actually get it wrong just by zooming in on the one.
I mean, I think we've discussed this. Like, you can be right that females produce female gametes that we call ova, but if from that you think you have fully, like, that's all you need to focus on, this is
the mystery of
you've solved the problem of women, then you are going to treat women in a really odd,
materialistic, reduced,
crass kind of way.
Yeah. So kind of building on what we have been talking about, so we're looking at these different kind of, maybe you could call them layers, just ways of seeing, like, one being produced by economic structures. I guess consumerism would fall in that too. Another by just our, like, symbolic world order, which also has a material function too. Like, we talked about the institution of the religious, of the monks and the nuns, and how that changes our social imagination of the symbolic. And we're still going to kind of move off of that. How does our social imagination of what sex is, of what gender is, of what this is for, of what it means change? How does that change when we introduce new technology like contraceptives and abortion? Because it's not just, I think we can be so... we're such an individualistic society that we just have such a narrow way of looking at things, and we just look at an abortion or an act of contracepting. And it's harder for us to zoom out and really see how individual actions really changes the whole way that society thinks and imagines and perceives itself. And there'll be some concrete examples, but the way that we're diving into this topic is by taking a look at two papal encyclicals, Humanae Vitae by Papal VI, and then Donum Vitae, which was written by, at that time, the CDF. Now, what's it called now? The DDF? There was a name change.
Yeah, there was.
Whatever the group of people who are in charge of, guarding, clarifying
teaching.
doctrine. And this is when Ratzinger was the head of the CDF.
Mm-hmm.
Both documents are really excellent. So if you haven't read them, I would highly, highly suggest reading them, especially Humanae Vitae, because it's just a beautifully crafted letter. It's just gorgeous to read. And then I think Donum Vitae is more German.
Yeah, and it's somewhat more technical in what it wants to define, because it has a lot of lifting to do. It's a critique of IVF, reproductive technologies.
Right.
What I would say about these two documents is that they've been understandably taken as moral prohibitions, that their fundamental purpose was to answer the question, can we use contraception? And they said no.
So just Humanae Vitae was written in 68 and Donum Vitae in 87.
Yeah, and it's true, they did. They said no, and there's been a understandable it's been impressive for the Catholic, because the Catholic Church at this point is the only major world institution saying no to contraception. Like, there really is none other. I
don't know. Does Islam?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know about them. But I mean, certainly among the Christian denominations.
Can you Google that, Alex? Yeah, but and yeah, certainly in the West. I think they don't. No, actually, I think they don't, because my mother, who teaches natural family planning, often works with Muslim couples.
Yeah, but if they're Americanized, there's a lot of things that they're not doing.
That's true.
But I mean, certainly out of the Christian West, all the different major Christian churches have slowly conceded abortion and contraception to the culture, and everyone was kind of essentially petitioning Paul VI at the time to get with the times, and he wrote this beautiful letter in response to it. And what really impressed me was that he didn't come down like heavy-handed. He wasn't angry about it. He wasn't like a tyrant, and he acknowledged that he was saying things that people did not want to hear. It really is a pastoral letter. Mm-hmm. It's awesome. So if you haven't read that one, for sure, you should absolutely go and read it. It's not very long at all.
And what it does is it expresses a worry and a concern about our social imagination. It is concerned with our dependency on technology and the way in which contraception as a normal, licit act within society begins to shape our imagination about who we are, and then especially who and what children are. And ultimately, just like what the meaning of the person is. Right.
Because the way we see other people and the things that we do, like, really, like, are shaped by, like, actions or technology or even the law, just a notion of what is licit or illicit according to our local government is going to change the way that we, like, see those acts. Mm-hmm. And so we have a real responsibility when we know that we're shifting things, because it's going to have a big social impact. So I guess that's another kind of aspect about these two documents that's important to emphasize, and it starts to make a lot more sense of why this is such a big deal for the church, why the popes were saying something about this, is because it really has such a huge social import. It's not that he's just looking at individual acts and saying, like, people need to pull it together in these, like, little individual spheres that have no like, far-reaching consequences. I mean,
which is, I think, why the encyclical was not comprehended, why the letter was rejected and then marked returned to sender, because we have even in the church, have really digested the individualism that liberalism is predicated on, that our own societies are predicated on. And so we ask the question of, why is this wrong for me to do?
Yes.
I have my own individual person with whom I'm responsible for, and I can do these particular acts, and you're telling me that this one act is something I can't do. Why not? It's not hurting anyone, etc. Like that. Those were the arguments, and it was so poorly received. because it was written in a time of intense individualism. I mean, 60s.
Right.
When sort of we're seeing, if you want to go back and watch the episode where we discussed Christopher Lash's book, you can kind of see why the world was not prepared to think socially. But I think Humanae Vitae is a social encyclical. Mm-hmm. It is saying that our acts are intimately related and called forth by others and for others, and that we cannot simply act as an individual, but we always presuppose a view of our neighbor in our own acts.
Right. And it's not even merely that, like, I think that my secret sin won't, like, have an effect, like a domino effect.
Yeah.
I think that's moving in the right direction, that sin really does have a domino effect. But it's also a lot more than that. But I think we'll get to that later. Sure. And for now, just kind of talking about a little bit of the content of Humanae Vitae as kind of a launching point. I really love the way that he begins. He is, I think, really honest in acknowledging where the questions are coming from, and it's not merely from like this place of individualism and selfishness. Right. Like there's like this new fear, he says, of like population growth.
Yes.
There's like all this new tech being introduced, and like things are changing, so that if we have to continue living what the church has been teaching, then it's going to involve like a new level of sacrifice that we haven't had like been able to like it just wasn't relevant.
Yeah, I mean, just consider the fact that the average size of a family within the Middle Ages, within the Christian world, was like 2 or 3. And it wasn't because people were being selfish. It was because they were experiencing a lot more death, both in pregnancy itself and then in early childhood. And so in some ways, it simply wasn't a concern. The concern was always a question of survival. Not only survival. I'm not trying to make it like this dark and bleak thing, but like there really was the reality of death and the real chance that children wouldn't make it. And a lot of our teaching in the church that we received really was coming out of this world. So there wasn't this sense of how do I close myself off to life that wasn't a fundamental concern that would solve problems. The problem is more, how do I get these children to live? How do we ensure in this great fragile time period? So now you fast forward. Now
I wonder if the
maternal the birth rate increases, and you have the ability to save lives more directly through new medical technologies, and to save women in crisis pregnancies. And so we are not, and there's also things like nutrition that's changing, but we're in a different scenario, right, where we have new temptations.
Yeah.
Like the temptation is not to despair in like the meaninglessness of life because of death's sort of oncoming jaw. The question is more like, hey, how do you have 6 kids when you have no money? That kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, I am kind of curious about that stat of the average size of families. I know you've talked about it before, but I don't know, that I would like to look into that more. But I think certainly the situation has changed where survival for children is a lot higher. Mm-hmm. So like things have shifted, and yeah, there's new sacrifices that like you have to live with now in modern society if you're still going to be doing what the church is teaching, even if that sacrifice is like not looking like other people, not doing the thing that other people are doing.
Sure.
And then another kind of, I guess, like objection he brings up is like, well, like, shouldn't we like regulate birth by reason and will? Mm-hmm. If I can will, like when I have a child, like, will and reason is higher than the body.
Yeah. So
it kind of makes sense like that. And then he says that for people talking about like contraceptives, there's an appeal to the demands of conjugal love and responsible parenting. And I think that kind of sums up the two concerns of modern people, the demands of conjugal love and responsible parenting. And I really like the way that he responds to it. He was like, all right, well, like if this is a thing that like we're appealing to, then we should really understand like what is the meaning of conjugal love then, and what is the meaning of responsible parenthood? Like what does that entail?
Yeah.
And it's just so cool to see the Pope writing about that like conjugal love has its origin in God, who is love, and that what this thing is fully human. So it always, like every act always involves the body and spirit, the unity of that whole person. It's always something that is a total love. This is a special and unique friendship where everything is shared between the couple. It's faithful and exclusive till death. And then it's also fruitful. It's not an insular kind of love that just keeps it all to itself. It's always open to the possibility of it sharing and spilling out into more life, which is, if you're compelled by poetics, like this is just very beautiful. And then when he talks about responsible parenthood, that involving like having respect for your body and for its functions, the ability to exercise and have dominion over your passions, like in order to give like a gift of self to the other person, like you have to actually be self-possessed.
Yeah, it's this turn where the question can be given functionally, like responsible parenthood must mean having kids at the right time when you can afford it. And the Pope seems to be saying, no, remember that this is an act of love, which means to be responsible to the kind of love that we're committed to until death means acting in a certain way towards the one we love and towards the fruit of that love. And it's sort of a paradigm shift. So, and it's romantic. This is what I love about it, is that there's something so sexless about contraception, and not just because it's a contraceptive. It's like the introduction of a pharmacist to love life has never really been a source of warmth in my mind. But nothing against pharmacists. I'm sure you guys are great, but but there's something so romantic about the Pope, because he's saying like, look, I understand the concerns and the difficulties, but responsibility in a matter of love needs to be the kinds of acts by which we love each other best, not by which we say like, okay, we have this love thing, but it needs to be kind of curtailed here because it's really costing a lot, and it needs to be cut there because we're really worried and fearful. It's saying like the attitude should never be, how do we limit love for the sake of other goals, but rather how do we love perfectly without fear. And he's certainly not saying by that like, so don't make any decisions or make any plans. I mean, this is the encyclical where he just thoroughly affirms that couples have recourse to the use of their natural cycles in order to space births as well as natural breastfeeding, and that they can do this with a just reason. This is not there's nothing illicit about this, because his concern is that in the marital act, the symbolism of the body as a gift, as the gift of the person, is preserved.
Yeah, I think like what he really does is like resituate the questions. Like the real question is about love. And so if we know that this is true about human love, that it's like conjugal love, like it's always total, it's faithful, it's exclusive, it's always open to life, and it's not like this like closed off insular thing, and it's something that's fully human. So whenever I engage in this act, I'm always attentive not just to the body but also the spirit of the person. It changes the question, it changes the thing that you are anxious about. Like the real question is like, how do I love this person well, instead of just kind of like looking at your exterior situation and just being ruled by anxiety and fear, which I think is why a lot of people turn to contraceptives.
It's certainly the time when contraceptives ever appeared tempting is when you're scared. So it makes sense.
So then he goes on to explain just like I really like the meaning of sex, and that like we know naturally just by use of human reason that there's this unitive aspect to it and there's a procreative aspect, and he's asserting that this is the meaning of sex, and that's something that you can't separate it from each other. And so every act together essentially always has to be a total act of love, not just a partial act of love. And that's kind of in reference to what we were talking about earlier. Like if you just emphasize or isolate one aspect of the truth, then you end up distorting the whole. So if you like end up isolating the procreative, I think is a really easy one to see. And then you're just obviously like using this other person like just to get like an heir to the throne or something like that. I mean, that's not really a thing that is as much concern today.
Not typical, no.
But I mean, like it's obvious that if you just isolate that from like the unity with your partner, then it's going to fall into use. But I think it's also pretty obvious that if you just isolate the meaning of sex to just like this unitive or pleasurable experience, then you're just going to fall into this attitude of using the other person, because you're not acknowledging like the full reality of them, who body and spirit, like their capacity to become mother, their capacity to become father. You're disregarding the truth of their body.
Yeah, and I think sometimes we don't appreciate the romance that the Pope is encouraging here, because we can make it sound like it's a law and there's two things that have to be extrinsically attended to, as if they were not part and parcel of the one whole act of love. As if you could say like, all right, make sure you got 50% unity, 50% procreative openness, and you put that together and you have moral sex that the Pope approves of. It's not quite that. I mean, rather, I think it's very obvious to anyone that reflects on it that you don't have one ultimately without the other.
Right.
So for instance, you can desire procreation, you can desire a child, but if you are going to be open to the fulfillment of that desire, if that's going to happen, then I've noticed that you can't actively pursue the procreative element of sex. You have to pursue the unitive one. This might just seem obvious, but the truth of the matter is very fascinating. You don't get a child by willing a child. You get a child by loving your wife, and by the wife loving her husband. What I mean is that the unitive act has to be pursued precisely for its own sake in order to have openness to the procreative side of things. To isolate one, and it goes the other way around too. Like when we are open to life, then the unitive act has a transcendent purpose. We have a certain, what I mean is if we close our mind to just the unitive and we desire unity and ultimately mutual sort of pleasure, then what can happen, especially over time, is that because it's our explicit goal, it becomes hard to get. Because unity and romance and pleasure are things that are fruits of love and not like the direct objects. Like you can't simply say to someone like, let's unify. It has to be a pursuit of something together. And then the unity is a fruit. And pleasure is a fruit. Pleasure is not something that you can guarantee for yourself or the other. And so in our openness to life, we receive the gift of unity. In our openness to unity, we receive the gift of life. And these are part of one integral act of love that the Pope wants to defend from a kind of utilitarian separation of like trying to get this end of just unity, trying to just get the child.
Yeah. Another thing that kind of comes to my mind when you isolate the unitive, then you have this like fear of the other person that's introduced into the equation. Like, what if this works out properly?
Yeah.
like, what if you work according to how you are, to who you are? There's a weird kind of fear introduced to love, which is not supposed to be there. And he doesn't go into all of that detail. I think it's in response to John Paul's Theology of the Body and also Humanae Vitae that people have really done a lot of fantastic work of kind of breaking this down. Like, what does this really mean? But I mean, I do think that like he kicks it off, this conversation, a very, very clear and loving, and like you were saying, a romantic way. Like, this doesn't sound like boring moralism. It's like what we desire here is attentiveness to the other person. And he says as much later on, which is, I think, one of the most powerful parts of the document. So kind of his argument is that you can't use this gift while also destroying its meaning and purpose. Like, you're just going to break something, and it might not be obvious immediately, but it's certainly going to come down the pike at some point. And he talks about this in a particular section that people have seen as being profoundly prophetic of exactly everything that has happened since we've just freely introduced these technologies into our society. So if you don't mind, I was just going to read that section. So, so this is the section, paragraph 17, where he talks about, he's warning of the grave consequences of the methods of artificial birth control. Upright men can even better convince themselves of the solid grounds on which the teaching of the Church in this field is based, if they care to reflect upon the consequences of methods of artificial birth control. Let them consider, first of all, how wide and easy a road would thus be opened up towards conjugal infidelity and the general lowering of morality. Not much experience is needed in order to know human weakness, and to understand that men, especially the young who are so vulnerable on this point, have need of encouragement to be faithful to the moral law, so that they must not be offered some easy means of eluding its observance. It is also to be feared that the man, growing used to the employment of anticonceptive practices, may finally lose respect for the woman, and, no longer caring for her physical and psychological equilibrium, may come to the point of considering her as a mere instrument of selfish enjoyment, and no longer his respected and beloved companion. We can stop there. He goes on. That's, but I think even at that point, like, he's so merciful and understanding of like the human condition. Like, we're weak and we know ourselves. We know that these natural barriers to immorality and infidelity are really helpful. Like, the fear of having a child is very helpful if you want to promote like relationships that are faithful. And so as soon as we introduce this technology and we suddenly make this like a lot easier, like, how are we not going to expect like families to be broken? How are we not going to expect, I mean, you just made like cheating on someone so much easier.
Yeah, sure.
Like, how do you not expect us to start doing these things?
Yeah. And he also, I mean, it's such a beautiful affirmation of the seasonality of women, especially, that women in their bodies are like a catechesis for learning difference, as opposed to the homogenizing sameness that men can be tempted to sort of make the whole universe a projection of themselves, that everything is just like me. It's all like me. Women in their bodies demand a different response, because to love a woman, you have to ask where she's at. This is obviously true in terms of the cycle of fertility, but it's also, as the Pope mentions, true psychologically. I mean, he's referring to this equilibrium. And everyone knows, I mean, that with menstrual suppression through oral contraceptives, that what you basically manage to do is create a sort of mode for women where, biologically speaking, they always are kind of their body thinks, I'm using air quotes, that it's pregnant, and so they have a kind of non-seasonal, constant appearance. And I think there's something that is just very offensive about that to begin with, like to say that in order to be responsible, women have to become like man by destroying seasonality within themselves, and instead having the same kind of sameness and homogeneity that is part of the beauty of the male experience of sexuality. So that's offensive in its own right, but I think what's also lost, and most feminist critiques are aware of this. They understand that this is the result of the need for women to be like males within capitalism, which requires homogeneous governance of people's bodies and of sameness in order to operate a mass society. You can't. In a mass society, it's hard to propagandize and to have a stable flow of workforce if half of your workforce might be in a completely different mood or in a completely different state or incapable of work at any given moment. So the feminists know this, but what I love from the Pope is that he understands the woman's body to catechize the male. So it's not simply that the woman is being mistreated, it's that the man's maybe the primary motivation of learning to be gentle, of learning to care, of learning to ask the question of where is this person now? What Aquinas talks about in terms of law, he says that all law should be open to person and circumstance. So it's not just like in our governing of the world, in our politics, that we get to just treat everything the same. All law has a certain subordination to the particularity of the person and the particularity of their circumstance. And justice, to be a just ruler, to be a just king, is always to have that attentive to person and circumstance. But where in the cosmos is person and circumstance more evident than in the body of the woman, who literally teaches the man that if you are to love me, you must be attentive to my person and circumstance. Right. Which men, obviously, there's something in that in men, but to a much less degree. Like we're always like, just love me the same way all the time, please. And that's sort of, I think where the Pope has. Yeah, well, he has
a sensitivity to women just because women are more vulnerable in that area, just because like our sexual lives are very different, and so as soon as women become constantly available to men, it's just a lot easier for men to use women. I mean, like he just describes exactly what has been happening to women following this moment. And he does kind of talk about what you were saying about the importance of attentiveness to the other. Like marriage and sex really is supposed to be a training ground for love. And I think because in our culture, like we've equated the two so much, or we've just have this notion of love being like a feeling or an affection, even if it's a very pure affection, that like love really is a habit and a virtue. So towards the end, he talks about the mastery of self, which is really what the ultimate goal is. It's not just the church saying no. Like what the church desires is for you like really like to be your own master of your body, not to like suppress it, which is what contraceptives do, but to be a master, to rule it without harming the natural like functioning of your body.
It wants you to have power. Contraception wants the pharmacy to have power. Yeah.
It just wants you to be impotent.
Yeah.
And so he says, so like the discipline really of like mastering your own passions in order to be attentive to like the state of where the woman is in her cycle. He says, yet this discipline, which is proper to the purity of married couples, far from harming conjugal love, rather confers on it a higher human value. It demands continual effort, yet, thanks to its beneficent influence, husband and wife fully develop their personalities, being enriched with spiritual values. Such discipline bestows upon family life fruits of serenity and peace and facilitates the solution of other problems. And this is the part that I thought was really important. It fosters attention for one's partner, helps both parties to drive out selfishness, the enemy of true love, and deepens their sense of responsibility.
Yeah.
So I really like that he points out that like love really demands continual effort. And I don't think we like that idea at all, because it just sounds like work without rest. But he's saying that it's in kind of entering into the continual demand of love that you end up deriving like the true like fruits of serenity and peace, because when like you continually make the effort to drive out selfishness and continually make the effort to be attentive to your partner, it may involve like sacrifice in the moment, but especially when it becomes a habit, it's not even tiresome.
Yeah, I mean, we recall that the virtuous man is the one who takes pleasure in virtue. And one of the reasons Aquinas says that sexual pleasure would have been more intense prior to the fall, and is less so now, is because of his understanding of virtue being a perfection of human power, and knowing that there's just nothing better than the exercising a perfected power. I mean, there's a mastery that we all admire when we see someone at a craft, like a woodworker, and we can see that he's doing things effortlessly, that he's enjoying his work, and that the product, the fruitfulness of his work is evident, but it doesn't come as a sort of agony.
Right.
But you know at the same time that there was
An
agony prior to this, that this was hard won. And we have this weird way of imagining, despite all of our enlightenment, that in the sexual act, there's no apprenticeship, and there's no mastery, and there's no moment
Oh, that's a really good point.
of growth. And so we think of it as like, well, that's just, and I do think it's like ironic, because we think we're so wise about things, and so, but like when it comes to sex, it's like this is the robot form that the bodies use, and it's always the same, and you do the thing and never disrupt that. Like it just seems like ridiculous. Anyone who's loved another person knows that you've begun to be melted down. What's that called? When you're in the crucible and you're refining yourself, and that the sexual act is no different. It is by nature, in the natural symbolism of the body and the way that it's done, it is, or at least can be, a growth and perfection unto a point of mastery, like everything else in life. And instead, we try to imagine it as something that's already self-justified and already mastered just by virtue of being itself. And then contraception is a way of arresting or freezing. Not just contraception, but many other things are ways of arresting and freezing and saying, this adolescent experience and fantasy will remain untainted, and I will always have just this.
Or like thinking that that's kind of the ceiling.
Yeah, like this is as good as it gets, baby. Which is
like
why
this experience is the highest experience, and there's nothing that goes beyond that. And it's hard to believe that there is something that goes beyond that if you haven't like really progressed towards something higher.
Yeah, which is what explains our society is not one in which, because of the proliferation of contraception, we're all having a great sexy time out there. It's rather that it's seen as, I mean, we're increasingly sexless. We're increasingly tending towards androgyny, of not really enjoying powerful expressions of femininity or masculinity. The romance is sort of vaguely uncomfortable and cringe, and we, all in all, I think, could be described as disappointed. Like it's
yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so I think that this is, you could compare this to like the medieval society, where I look at their romances, and even as a Catholic, I'm almost scandalized by how much they love women. It's like, just chill out, guys. I mean, like, come on. You can elbow them in the ribs still, but they're like, I mean, there's a floridness to it that needs purification, but definitely like their tendency is to see in romance a sort of infinity, a divine source, something that you plunge ever deeper into. And our sense is like, well, I don't even know. It's just very boring.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of see it, or just like the mental image that I having now is a spiral upwards or a spiral downwards.
Sure. Yeah.
Like anyone who has been kind of overcome by vice, like, you know what it feels like. I think gluttony is an easy one, especially because it's so analogous. Like when you fall into the trap of gluttony and just giving into that pleasure, like you feel weak, you feel less yourself. And then trying to like climb out of that situation is very difficult and it is agonizing. But when you can get to the other side of really being a master of yourself and a master of your desires, like it really is a lot more pleasurable to be strong. It just, you feel all over better. Dang, there was something else I was going to say too that was better than that comment. Darn it. I think it's lost.
I'm sorry. I was thinking as you were saying that of...
I remembered. I remembered.
I gave you some time.
I think it makes love more of an adventure and more exciting because there really is something to grow into together. Not just like in your married life in the way that you love each other, like in the home, like putting each other first, but even like in the bedroom too, there's still so much room to grow in like the purity of your love for this other person and your attentiveness. Like it opens up the space for the adventure that we know that romance really is. And I think I don't know, like maybe people like have an attitude towards love in the same way that they have an attitude towards like their college days. Like when I was young and able to do these things, like this was kind of the glory days, and since there's no further adventure for me like into virtue, then things are just going downhill from here. So at a certain point, like you're just going to be old and things aren't going to be the same.
Yep, you're going to be old, you're going to die. That's what we're here to tell you. Everything we say about gender is just, I think, the consequence of actually saying you're going to die, and then everything else follows from it. But you see how in our culture in which contraception destroys the idea of love as a dealing with surprise and a dealing with difference, and turns it into a homogeneous repetition of the same, you lose that catechesis of difference, where it's like, this person needs my love, my attention, my care in who she is now. And then, like you said, you lose the idea of love and sexual love itself as a object of self-mastery, and that's an object of perfection and of skill. And instead, you get this idea of it more as a commodity that you receive in the same way each time. And then you're right. It seems like our culture becomes very obsessed with preserving it, pickling it, pickled sex. There it is, new polity, 2024. Preserving it as that kind of primordial instance of its unconstrained youthfulness. And so you have, like women who feel obliged to surgically alter their bodies so that they remain in the kind of sexual state that they were when they were first entering into their fertility. Or you have men who just absurdly can't grow old and wise, but see in sex like the need to safeguard and repeat the experience of like adolescent irresponsibility, and that there's no, it's just boring. It's like it's fear-based and boring. The whole approach towards aging and death and difference becomes one of like desperate attempts to preserve youthfulness, which, as everyone knows, and this is the other thing, I keep coming back to this, it's just that stuff isn't a sexy good time. Like when we begin to be motivated out of fear, when we begin to be motivated out of something besides the romance and adventure of love, it's not like you even lose the pleasures you kind of get from briefly flirting with the exalted feeling of like, domination or like the sort of sexual prowess or whatever. That goes away too, because you get old and die. And so the refusal to see sexuality as something that belongs in its symbolism and by nature to a process of greater and greater mastery that we really are responsible for and cannot abdicate to a technology, actually, I think, preserves this actually leads to greater pleasure and to greater fulfillment and to greater transcendence. Whereas sort of the effort to always keep a golden age, keep a glory days sort of safe and contained, doesn't lead to great freedom and self-forgetfulness and ecstasy and joy and pleasure. So
it just fails.
Yes, unfortunately.
So that's kind of wrapping up the first document, Humanae Vitae. I think there's kind of less things to say about Donum Vitae in the sense that it's just not as poetic, but it's answering particular technology questions.
Yeah, I mean, one more thing I wanted to say before we jump there is that Humanae Vitae has, I think, its place in the sort of in the salvation narrative and the biblical narrative. Sometimes we forget that we still are the Bible, like we are the church. It doesn't stop with the New Testament as like a book. It goes on into our lives. And so we see repetitions of what happened in the Old Testament and in the New Testament in our own lives. And Humanae Vitae, if you look at the story of the Bible, it's already happened in some ways. You had, after the fall of man, you have the flood narrative, which is kicked off when the sons of God, that's going to be confusing, when humanity starts to, quote, take wives as they would. This inaugurates a sort of wickedness in mankind. It's a little obscure what's going on exactly, but what we know is that wives are not being treated well in some fashion. In the Talmud, in the Midrash, and the Jewish sort of reflection on this, they often say, well, this was homosexuality, this was bestiality, this was rape. But what's sort of consistent in this interpretation of the pre-flood narrative is that women were not being seen with attention and care, but were being taken by men who, in their very taking, seemed to view themselves as divine, as having some kind of exalted status. So they take the wives they chose. And the flood happens. Mankind is punished for whatever these sins are. God makes a new covenant with man. And by the time you get to the Old Law, where God is literally giving to man the order as a law that he rejected as something he had by grace in the Garden of Eden before the fall. He's legislating for man because man sort of abdicated his responsibility. And one of the things that the Old Law very obviously does, and it's harsh and it's in the form of a punishment, this is how we understand law, is that it's because we didn't do it by gift and by grace that we now receive it as law. The seasonality of women is enforced. So for the Jewish people, they undergo a very difficult and legal regimen of purity laws that define by law when you can approach a woman and when you can touch her and when you can make love with her, with your wife. And so this involves like the menstrual cycle. This involves the famous red tent, which is where, it just sounds awesome, I think, where during the menstrual period, women would all get to hang out apart from men in a tent. But it also involves the whole rituals of purity for marriage. Like it was a very limited time. And we can see this. I certainly saw this at first.
Being like absurd and like, what is this going to do to the psychology of women?
Yeah, like oppressive until women started pointing out that the one thing they would love to do is be apart from men during their menstrual cycle, like certain periods of it. So then I started to grow a little more sympathy with the Old Law. Like, wait, maybe it's actually enforcing something that we should be listening to, and in a harsh, obvious way that,
because if you were living in a more pagan society, because that's what it was. I mean, like humanity had fallen into paganism, and God's trying to slowly pull people out of it. What may seem like just a harsh law upon women is actually their protection. So providing them like times of the month where like it would be very uncomfortable to have sex, and just saying you can't do that.
Yeah.
And then also protecting their natural cycle.
Yeah. It's like God deliberately and legally protects seasonality and fertility in women through the thing that the thing that Israel understood at the time, which is cleanliness and purity.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't, in fact, just a matter of cleanliness and purity, and this is why we don't ever stop at the old law. Like,
right.
The old law is not a matter of the new law is written on our hearts. And so when you see the Pope saying, we need to not act in this way that's going to treat women as just something you can take whenever you want, as the sons of God take the daughters of men, but you need to appreciate the seasonality of a woman in marriage, which is the only sort of space in which to know gender, know man and woman. Then you can kind of see a repetition in the New Covenant, in our age of the New Testament, what was going on in the Old. That once again, seasonality is being given by the Pope, by the Church, to an increasingly pagan people, and the pagan people are experiencing it as a harsh law of purity.
Right.
And we are experiencing it as a harsh law of purity. And it's
true.
only by grace and by attention to the magisterial teaching of the Church that we're able to see it not as a harsh law of purity, not a repetition of the old law, but in fact the new law of grace, a call of love.
Right.
And so we see it as like, oh, we're not allowed to do this and we're not allowed to do that, which is, that's how the Jewish people saw the law.
Right.
At times, anyways.
And I think we will kind of get to that too, but I think, again, part of the reason why we're not able to see the logic of it is because we're still so focused on like our individual experience, like why is it wrong for me?
Yeah.
And not seeing like the social pattern in which we're participating in. Like with the whole idea of like social imagination, like how, like the way that the Jews must have seen women or seen themselves was changed because of the laws that they participated in. Like by nature, if you're not like allowed to like approach a woman at certain times, like on something other than just I don't know, like your own decision or just kind of like this like imposition from the hierarchy of men onto the women, but like coming from God, something outside of you, then like there's something like given and true about the woman that's I don't get to decide. I can't just take her whenever I want. I mean, it changes the way that you perceive people, because this is the way that the whole social order is acting.
Yeah, and I think the woman is given in our creation always as a sign of difference generally, of catechesis of how to be generally, which is always to know persons through love, and to not know them as a sort of repetition of yourself.
Right. And then I think the other document kind of takes that same logic, but then really shows how that extends to the child in Donum Vitae, which again is more technical because he's talking about like IVF. Or surrogate mothers and things like that. But I think one of the most profound statements, and I don't remember where this is he talks about how, like, always the child has equal dignity as the parents who gave that child life, which is, it's so interesting to think about that, because we live in an age where we're so obsessed with like the children getting what they want. Like we have to treat the children like adults. They have their own desires. They have their own lives. Like we can't interfere with them. We can't impose our own beliefs on them. But it's really the church in this instance saying like, hey, like that little embryo, that little child has the same dignity as you who are calling it forth into life. And this child deserves to be brought into life through love. Yeah. And so that's kind of the moral explanation for why the church does reject IVF, and like surrogate mothers and like sperm donors and those kinds of things, is because it separates that child from being born into like a world where like his identity is kind of solid and known, like this is my mother and this is my father. And it also just precludes any possibility of that the act that brought him into the world not being done through love. Because as soon as you have something like IVF, like the way in which this child was conceived was like through essentially an experiment with a third party, like the scientists. And that's not appropriate to the dignity of that person who's coming into the world. It just invites like a little bit more like confusion and ungroundedness about that kid's identity, or like having like another partner, like a sperm donor, into the life of this couple. Like suddenly, like, I don't know who my dad is. Like, I know my dad, but I don't know my dad. The emphasis on the dignity of the child, I think, is really beautiful.
The great burden of Donum Vitae is that the child deserves to be born in and through love. And the argument against this, the best argument against this, is something to the effect of, well, we can love that child and we can accept that child apart from the particularities of the procreative act, right? So it's like, and I think there is some truth to this. Like, of course, everyone who desires a child desires to love a child and is open to life on some level. They're actively seeking to bring a child into the world. And Ratzinger is affirming this, absolutely. But what I think goes missing sometimes in our reading of this is that the body means something, and the body is a symbol. And when we don't reproduce, we provide, as it were, the conditions by which God creates once again. That's what we're doing when we make love. And the meaning is objective because our bodies really are what they are, and they symbolize something in particular. And so the child doesn't just have the right, they use the term right, to a sort of abstract affirmation of their goodness that is separated from the actual act that leads to their conception, that collaborates within God's creation. Rather, the act itself needs to be one that of love. Right.
Like I think like a
unitive and procreative, as they say.
A helpful way to think about it is that like it's the origin story of the child.
Yeah.
And it might not seem like that's significant, but like the story of this child's entrance into the world is supposed to be, by design, a revelation of who that child is and what that child is for. And so if you have a situation where like you have a man and a woman coming together in love, like that explains so much about your life. Like I came into this world from two people, like in this like relationship of total self-giving love. That's the kind of thing from which I came, and that's the thing towards which I go.
And I think the nature of the body and of sex is such that it also makes very natural the affirmation that you're created by God. It's not whereas, I mean, you can think of the obvious example is that when you're paying money to get a child and you're donating sperm, or it's sort of one step harder to make that affirmation that I am a unique creation willed by God, because you are created in such a manner that becomes obscure. Not real, obviously, but obscure. Right. It's like, I am created by doctor, I'm created by this industrial medical process, I'm created by having the privilege of having this much, my parents having this much money and of their desire. Never mind the fact that, a lot of these procedures kill other formed embryos. Sorry, no, I just wanted to say, like, the symbolism of the procreative act absolutely says, I was born in love and in unity of this marriage and these people and their love for each other, and that is what we shouldn't do anything to hinder that. But then also the nature of the symbolism of the body also makes it strongly evident, I would say, that it's not like that it was a sort of choice of human beings that I came to be,
Mm-hmm.
rather as an openness of human beings to God, to something
Right.
transcendent.
Right. I guess I was thinking it might be helpful to share just kind of how I process all this
Sure,
stuff,
yeah.
like when I was like asking all these questions, because I grew up learning about theology of the body pretty young.
Mm-hmm.
And so like a lot of my questions were answered before I had questions
Mm-hmm.
about them, and it seemed to just make sense. I mean, when you read Humanae Vitae, even if you disagree, I think you can see the logic that's there, and you can kind of like you can follow the poetic logic. It makes sense that all these things kind of hang together. But I still felt like something was lacking. Like it was kind of like lacking a force. And really, I think I found that missing piece later because I was understanding more fully the nature of what humanity is, of what the human person is. So like I was talking about, our conception is our origin story. But like why does it matter? I mean, you could conceive of someone being conceived in a different manner, like a child conceived in rape, or like my friends who were conceived in IVF. Like that doesn't actually change the reality that they do come from God and that they are unconditionally loved by Him. So why is it that like this story even matters? And I think what helped me to really kind of gave like force to all the things that I had learned about in theology of the body for so long, was understanding like the symbolic nature of man, and then also the really social nature of man, not just like, we really need to be around people, otherwise we get sad and weird. But that like what it means to be human is in relationship to each other.
Yeah.
And that I think the whole like social imagination kind of helps us to see that even the way that we think and conceive of things depends so much on the social order in which we live.
Yeah.
That's just what it means to be human. And that like what we are and what creation is symbolic. Like what it means to be human is to speak something true about the nature of God. And so when I'm using my body, like it's possible to like speak falsehood about God through my body in the same way that I can speak falsehood about God and reality through my language. I remember growing up hearing the spousal meaning of the body or the language of the body, and it made sense to me, but I didn't really get that the human person is always symbolic. The human person is actually always speaking truth. And it's we learn about the truth through like our society and like through like looking around and seeing what other people are doing. Like we teach each other just by virtue of who we are. And I think you were kind of getting at that with like the attentiveness to the other person. Like man and woman teach each other by virtue of just being themselves about the nature of love.
Yeah, it's not like you have to say it. It's not informational.
And so suddenly it started to make a lot more sense to me why the family is so important, because like written into the cosmos is probably the most poignant revelation of the nature of love. And so that even if you live in a particularly broken circumstance, as long as your social order is upholding like this symbol, you still have access to what you know is true about love. Like you look at marriage and you understand that that the nature of love is to be like a total self-gift, and it is to be faithful. And it is not to be like just a selfish, insular thing, but it just brings forth more life. It's generous.
Yeah.
And so when we start messing with that symbol as an entire culture, then we start speaking falsely about the nature of God. And it's just the nature of love is just that much more difficult to access. And it obscures the truth about love, which means it's harder for us to actually do that in our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, to give a very maybe just a concrete example, The human person is loved unconditionally by God. He is created by God for his own sake. Like, God is thrilled by you. God is thrilled. He sings over his children, and he personally creates each one of us in the womb. You know, this great paradox in the Bible, and that in Genesis it says that God rested from his works, and then Jesus comes and says, no, my Father is working even now, is only resolved in the womb of the woman, where creation continues. Creation ends on the seventh day, but every child is a new work of God because God wants that child. It's Now that is something you cannot convey to a 2-year-old. They don't have language. They don't have reason. They need to come to know that. And it's not something that you can write on a card and send them for Valentine's Day or something. It's something that needs to be taught progressively. They need to ascend to divine heights and to know that about themselves. And so obviously every parent knows that it is, important. It seems to undersell it, but important to tell your child you love him and to make sure that it's known that that love's unconditional, which is hard, but to say it's not a love unless, it's not a love if, it's not a love for a certain amount of time, because you are who you are, I love you. And that teaches us about God. And the great difficulty of, and the great thing about the symbolism of sex, of what it means objectively, what we're doing with our bodies, is that it prepares us to be able to confidently and thoroughly say that to children, to say, I love you unconditionally. There was no if, and, or but. And the difficulty with the reproductive technologies that the popes are asking us not to become dependent on, these sort of third-party produced technologies, is that it obscures this unconditionality, which is so crucial to human persons becoming, it's just true. So, so it's crucial because it's true. So for instance, it says, and we'll speak more about this, but it observably is the case that the way that we make love is in fear of children arriving who are surprising or unexpected or have difficulties or at the wrong time, the wrong place, in the wrong way, who disrupt our particular goal of pleasure or unity. And then on the other side, there's technologies whereby we are not creating children in and through an act of openness and love, but through purchase and through
commodity.
And so it's not that, again, it's not that the child is somehow, created by some other source. It's just that when you pay for a child,
you see people.
You're going to see differently. And when you live in a society in which many people pay to have children, whether through sperm donors or within their own marriage, but extrinsically to the act of procreation, then it's just the case that a hint even of conditionality begins to characterize the human condition. It's like, I love you no matter what, has a tiny little asterisk by it. Right? And I think this makes generally relations harder within such a society.
Hopefully reality can overcome the origin,
totally. No, we're not condemned here.
But I think it is true. I think looking at both abortion, where you could have killed your kid, or looking at paying for a child, it just does set you up for failure, because it introduces a child into your life with the mindset of your origin story is from control.
Yeah.
And I think you do see this in kind of the parenting trends that you see just kind of floating around the internet. There's just a lot of anxiety and fear with children, not being able to control them. We do just the amount of overwhelming information about how parents should parent their children and just like how it's almost become a religion for people. I mean, I'm not really familiar with all the different kinds of parenting wars, but I know that they're out there.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if like that's like coming from like this source of like fundamental anxiety of like this kid came into my life through my control, and so like I need to like continue this process.
Totally. Yeah. No, there's just a fundamental difference in saying, I purchased something, and I was open to something and received it as a surprise. And the symbolism of sex tends to affirm the latter, and then the symbolism of contraception and abortion and IVF tends to affirm the former. And yeah, if you are even slightly seeing children as the results of our individual like will, then it can be very open to disappointment. You're not what I ordered. You're not what I bought. You're not what I wanted. You're not what I thought. I deserved you, and so went and got you, and so how could you be anything but what I deserved?
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that people actually think these things thoroughly. I'm just saying that this is.
I mean, I think it kind of like it just kind of happens in the background. Like, I mean, we all know the experience of just having these ideas that we're not thinking explicitly, but in hindsight, we can see that it was just there in the background, and that kind of affected our disappointment in the situation. I mean, you definitely see that in like, I think like kids are somewhat treated as like being a part of a lifestyle. Whereas I think that especially when you like look at like this is a training ground for the nature of love and the nature of your relationship with God. When you enter like fully into the symbol, when you enter fully into like what sex actually is and what children actually are, then it's easier to let go of the illusion that the meaning of my life is to have control. The meaning of my life is to control like these like goals that I have, like to attain this pleasure, to have this lifestyle, to do this thing, instead of understanding like my life. I don't know, like we all want the adventure story, but we don't actually want to live it. And I think the number one like prerequisite of the adventure story is just being called. It comes from without, and you don't know where it's going, and you don't know why you're the one who's been picked and chosen to go forward. And you can't really live it without just submitting to a lack of control. And I think all the introduction of all this technology really does shape our social imagination. It sets us up for failure because it's shaping our imagination of what like sex and what marriage and what children are supposed to be is something within our realm of control. And I think that's kind of the notion of responsible parenting.
Sure.
It's not like, okay, like how can I like be like responsible in like this adventure and bringing souls to God? It's like, all right, how can I be like responsible and like control things well? Yeah.
And people are free. And so you can see why, throughout the Bible and throughout history, tyranny and slavery are very associated with acts of population control. And you can see how we all kind of participate in this, right? Because if you have a society that's generally seeing other people as extension of plans that you develop, then you can see the desire to control people generally becoming a value within that society. It's like if we are really the result of a human being's plan, then we need to be sort of suppressed in our freedom to some degree, so that we continue to stick with that plan. A managerial society naturally results from a management, a technological management of the sexual act outside of procreation and the unity of spouses. And I think this is true, right, about the symbolism of our sexual bodies, that if it's trying to teach us something, it's trying to teach us to is trying to drag us along this adventure, as it were. So I think about like arousal to begin with, right? Because it sort of starts there. I mean, it starts I don't know where sex starts, but then arousal, you have this phenomenon that you do not decide your own arousal, but it's actually called forth by the other person. Mm-hmm. I mean, even like autoeroticism, which is obviously like makes these things sort of very difficult to imagine. Even autoeroticism, if anyone's honest about what it is imagining another, right. Imagining some other that calls forth arousal from you. So like the other is still present in autoeroticism. It's just we're trying to suppress the reality of the other. Mm-hmm. So the arousal is this experience of being out of control. I mean, and this is why it freaks out Augustine, and I get it. For Augustine, he's looking at arousal and he sees in it, and I think he's right. Like there is this fear-based, fear of death, and sin-based reality that means that arousal appears particularly out of control as just either devoted towards domination of others. Mm-hmm. But also kind of like dragging us towards procreation against our will almost.
Like an enslavement.
Yeah, it's like God saying, look, you can't be trusted to continue yourself on the face of the earth because of your sin. Therefore, I punish you with arousal so that it's going to happen. Sorry. And then Augustine sees this and sees this as a great sign of our sin because we basically can't really affirm the goodness of creation in our sin. It's important to realize, like, by definition, openness to life is always an affirmation that this world is good. It's to say with God what he said at the end of creation, that it's very good, because you don't will someone else to share in your joy unless you acknowledge that the thing to be shared in is joyful.
Good, yeah.
And so you affirm existence. So Augustine's concern is that in sin, we're no longer able to, our eyes are so darkened, we're no longer able to affirm existence. And so we're actually going to avoid procreation and seek out works of darkness and death. Ultimately, a sort of world suicide, I think, is his logical like end game of sin and of the works of darkness, which makes sense.
That checks out.
Yeah. And so we're given arousal as this kind of punishment. Okay. I think that is true in a sense, but what should also be realized is arousal, even prior to the fall, is always a sign of the other in our bodies. Mm-hmm. It's always a sign of an effect. We become affected. We are being called forth against any direct will we have. So the very first thing you kind of know about the sexual act is that it's not something that you can say simply, I desire, I will, here's my plan, right? And this fact of arousal, which you experience in your own body, extends logically to the relation between man and woman, that it becomes criminal, given the nature of arousal, to simply see sex as an imposition of one individual's plan on the other.
Right.
That's rape. Mm-hmm. And then even when we do what I think most modern sexual relationships do, which is say, okay, I have a plan for pleasure and you have a plan for pleasure, and so sex is going to be a mutual achievement of two individual plans. Mm-hmm. From the lesson that arousal itself is teaching us, this just looks like mutual rape. It's like you rape me and I'll rape you, which is to say you impose a plan on me, I'll impose a plan on you. We're not aiming at unity. We want the individual plans to be fulfilled without being open to being one thing, to being one family, which is known in the openness to life.
Yeah, because even in that situation, like you're still you're approaching the other person with this fear of who they are.
Yeah. Like you want a ceiling. You want to say, okay, and this is very clear in men's relationship to women right now, which is very infantile and characterized by a desire not to know fullness. So it's like you have this weird age where you have like guys who are they're watching pornography, they're obsessed with sex on some level, like it's on their minds, and they're like terrified of birth, and menstruation is disgusting and scary to them, and like both of these things are happening, and it's like that's the same person. Like the object of arousal is like, I mean, it's just it's so frustrating. It's like, well, whatever. The point I'm trying to make is just that we want to limit what a woman is to her meaning in terms of the plan of sexual pleasure. Like, I want to achieve this plan, and wait a minute, you've got other things, like you're more than this. There's circumstance, there's person here. That becomes fearful, and we become irate, men especially, when you're not allowed to just use technological means to cancel and destroy anything outside of the male plan. It's like, what, you have a child, implement technology of abortion. That wasn't part of the male plan. What, you have different moods in different parts of your cycle, implement the technology of contraception, because that wasn't part of the male plan. So it allows men to have a totally infantile sexuality and to normalize that through actually making it realized with the implementation of technologies. And unfortunately, this can go the other way. I mean, usually with women, it's like, not every act of sex is going to lead to the child I want. I'm not saying it. I mean, women can have different desires than just the child. I'm just pointing out that IVF has a similar approach where it implements the technology to make sure that the other person fulfills the plan of the individual. It's like, husband, man, you're going to need to, have sperm extracted for the sake of the plan that I have. And then what never happens is the overcoming or the transcendence of the individual, which is obviously what the sign of sex in the body is. Arousal is the sign that the other has sort of overcome you in some ways, that you're not just imposing an individual plan.
Like part of your, like, your own meaning and your own desires can't be fulfilled in yourself.
Totally.
And you really do have to kind of humble yourself and be vulnerable to the other person in order to achieve those ends.
And I think humility is a part of sexual difference. I mean, the attempt to, how do I put it?
Well, I mean, it is just a humbling act.
Well, no,
like, you're extraordinarily vulnerable. It's embarrassing to be discovered.
Right. As Augustine points out, you seek out darkness. Even a married couple seeks out darkness.
Right. And it's not because it's like just something that's dirty and that needs to be not in the light. And it's just like, this is vulnerable.
Yeah.
And this belongs to one other person and not to the public.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a teaching. Because the way arousal works is that in sexual desire, you're attentive to the desire of the other. And so you're humble because you're not trying to just attain your own ends. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to go into detail. It's just, everyone knows that if you try to attain your own ends, it's a bad time for everybody. And so incorporating the other into yourself, the self into the other, is humbling because you can't simply exalt over the other.
Right.
And this is why I think a lot of times people feel like the church has maybe just like an arbitrary, or not even the church, just tradition, honestly, not like as a Catholic law written down somewhere, just that there's a certain arbitrariness to like a sense that certain positioning or ways of doing things are scandalous, and there's like a tendency to want to just say like, well, that's all meaningless because it just was just like shame or fear based, and now we know better and stuff like that.
Now we've accepted and embraced our bodies, and we don't have shame about our desires and our pleasures. Yeah,
but usually the traditional prohibitions on sexuality, or like in its possible expressions, are an attempt to especially maintain the woman and what she symbolizes for man. So the woman symbolizes, and we do this to each other, but a woman symbolizes man's limitation and the goodness of his creatureliness, because the male is not the only thing. The male finds its limit. There's the female, and the male is only known insofar as he is helped in that knowledge in and through what he is not, the female. The male is only known through the female is only known through the male. And so there's a humility of creatureliness. We're not like God. where we're just super intelligible with no need for another person to be who we are. Rather, we are creatures, like we are needy. And so, for the Jewish people in the Talmud, there's this question of, maybe this is, well, whatever. It might seem a little crass, but I think it's actually very meaningful. It's like they said, why is the man on top of the woman during the sexual act? And you kind of expect I think you're trained to expect some patriarchal answer, like to dominate the cold, fluid, left-handed, sinister chaos part of the universe. That's why. It's not really what they said. They just looked at the old law, their law, and said, well, it's to remind them of their genesis, of their origin story. The woman looks at the man because that's where she is from, and the man looks at the ground because that's where he's from. So the way they're facing, earth and sky, has revelatory power, but it's not revelatory power unto the exaltation of everyone, but unto their humility. What does the sexual act teach? Well, it reminds you of your creatureliness.
Right.
You were created from the dust, Adam. Eve, you were created from the side of Adam, and that the position is relevant to that. Now, I'm not saying that like we should derive a law from this. I'm just saying like what you see there is the relevance of the symbolism of the body.
Right.
Like man and woman, human species is the only species that makes love face to face, with the possible exception of the bonobos apes, actually, though they don't really make eye contact or anything. So it's Anyways, the point is that the sexual act tends towards to see the person, to see the face, to see the other, and to a certain humility and accepting and loving, enjoying even of being limited.
Right.
Even in like the
the symbolism of being face to face, just in general, always signifies dignity.
Yeah, totally.
And so even in that, I think it makes sense to see in the sexual act again, like kind of the idea of the origin story, like we're birthed from a love that is like two people who have like total love for each other and have complete dignity, who are equals coming together. I don't think any of that's insignificant, and just revealing who we are to each other, and revealing the nature of love. Like it is something like dignified. It is something that is like face to face. Like face to face, I think, is also a similar symbolism to like being in the light. There is no hiding. Yeah,
reconciliation has that meaning. Like its Latin means like to have your face back towards the face of the other. Yeah, I think that's totally right. There's another there's another story that's a Jewish medieval story of Lilith, which gets too much credit for being like a proto-feminist story when it's, I don't know.
Isn't it kind of like a non-biblical myth that evolved?
It's like 13th century, I think. They're pretty sure. There's no ancient tradition here. This is just out there. But it, again, I think expresses what was obvious, or at least was, I don't know, it seemed obvious, was that the body is a symbol in sexuality, and the symbol is what it is in order to push us towards a kind of love that creates people, that participates in the creation of people who are loved unconditionally. So we can say with ease, I come from love. So we can know with ease, I'm unconditionally loved. That's my story. So in Lilith, it's like an alternative Eve prior to the good Eve. It's the bad Eve. And there's a lot that goes on. Poor Adam. But one of the things that Lilith refuses is the positioning of sex. So she doesn't want to see. She wants to be on top, and that's sort of why feminists are like, they're just like ta-da, she's a modern. Oh, sure. But the point is, the that it makes for Adam and Eve, it leads to envy and dissension and anger, and the effort to enjoy sex as a sort of competitive act of getting what the individual wants. Like, you don't want sex to be something you can win. It seems to me like if that is where our ethics or our technologies tend us, that we can like win and succeed at our individual plans through the other person, then we've already lost the ability to say of the fruits, children, people, that you are from love. And so in Lilith, you have this story of the original marriage breaking down because sex no longer symbolizes. It doesn't symbolize mutuality.
It's like a space of
dignity,
competition instead of a space of mutual gift.
Yeah, it's like an individualism where each seeks what they want, and it's a fight. Now, I don't think we should I'm not saying there's something to make out of this in terms of like some practical advice. I'm just saying the body is a symbol, and the symbol in arousal and the way we're shaped in sex itself tends us towards creating a kind of origin story for other people. So it tends to be a kind of act that doesn't just tell us how to think of our children and where they come from and who they are, but people generally, because every person comes from this. And the popes, I think, are in touch with this like broad and traditional and cosmic symbolic tradition, and they have concern for the image. They have concern for the symbol, and so
because the symbol, like again, like we are the symbol, and the symbol actually does things. It really changes the way that we see the world and see love and see the opposite sex. And I think it's just really obvious when we think about the culture, because again, when we have this very individualistic mindset, and it's like, well, why is it wrong for me? It's like, well, just like walk outside into the world. Like the way that men and women see each other is not good. And this didn't come from nowhere. Technology, like the things that we do really do shape the way that we see and treat each other. And then the way that we treat each other just compounds the same kind of social imagination of who the other is.
Yeah, absolutely.